Hey guys, it's Godbars here, the self-proclaimed, completely unqualified hip-hop historian. The second album I wanted to talk about, I chose one of my personal favorites from the legendary MF Doom, who we tragically lost a few years ago now. Doom has been in my personal top three for at least a decade, and more often than not, I name him as my GOAT rapper, which is a term I don't really use lightly. Obviously, this take has become a lot more popular since his death, but he was a personal hero of mine way before that. The mask was actually the first tattoo I ever got, and he was my favorite rapper years before that. While his discography spans multiple decades and is studded with gems, most people commonly consider Mad Villainy his magnum opus, and I tend to agree. It's not really a controversial take, but that doesn't take anything away from his myriad of other classic albums. And if I had to pick a favorite Doom project outside of that aforementioned Madlib collab, it would definitely be Vaudeville Villain. If you somehow aren't familiar with MF Doom by now, he was one of the most prolific and influential rapper producers in hip hop, specifically the underground. A lot of contemporary popular rappers over the last decade have cited him as a big influence, including Joey Badass and the rest of the Pro Era crew, especially Capital Steez, who was another kind of personal hero of mine that whose death was a big blow to the hip hop community. You'll also hear the influence in guys like Rock Marciano, Ka, Jay Electronica, and, of course, Odd Future, most famously Earl and Tyler. Doom was actually really supportive of the younger rappers that looked up to him, and he ended up working with a good amount of them. He did a couple of tracks with West Side Gun from Griselda, and another one of my favorites is the song he did with Earl Sweatshirt and Captain Murphy, otherwise known as Flying Lotus. While Doom's sample heavy, comic book inspired production also had a lot of influence on acts like Czarface, it was mostly his four bar structure and trademark flow that influenced the younger rappers I mentioned. He also was a pioneer of releasing albums under an alias, along with guys like Kool Keith as Dr. Octagon and the various members of Gravediggaz. Some of these legendary personas included MF Doom, Viktor Vaughn, King Ghidorah, Metal Fingers, Doom, and that isn't even mentioning acts where he collaborated with another artist, like meeting up with Danger Mouse to make Danger Doom. When you add those projects, there's Mad Villain, JJ Doom, Neruvian Doom, West Side Doom, Doom Starks, and Czarface meets Metalface, just to name some. He was famous for always wearing his trademark mask, or infamous depending on who you talk to, though it's worth noting his first group KMD didn't feature this gimmick. They had a couple cult classics in the early 90s, but it wasn't until the death of his brother and fellow KMD member DJ Subrock that he'd step away for a few years and return with the Doom alias. Prior to that, he'd been known as Zevlov X, and he actually gained a little bit of notoriety when he was featured on the Gasface Third Bases single in 1988. KMD's debut album, Mr. Hood, came out in 1991, but while their following album, Black Bastards, was completed in 1993, it wasn't released until 2000 due to issues with the album cover and name. Some would say that the group being dropped by the label, the album being shelved, and his brother and fellow group member dying were things that kind of sparked the invention of the supervillain persona, because he had famously disappeared from the scene for multiple years in between the time that KMD ended, his brother died, and he came back with Doomsday. And while KMD has great classic material I consider essential for any Doom fan, like I said before, I think Operation Doomsday is where he really started to come into his own as a solo artist. Vaudeville Villain was released under the Viktor Vaughn moniker, and it was part of his legendary run of albums that came out from 2003 to 2005, which included Take Me to Your Leader, Vaudeville Villain and its sequel Venomous Villain, Mad Villainy, Food, Mouse in the Mask, and you could even add the first installment of the Special Herb series to the list since it came out in 2004. Needless to say, I don't think anyone in hip hop can really come close to matching this run, except maybe RZA with his most legendary run, but that was of albums he produced. What always made Vaudeville Villain so appealing to me is it takes that Marvel DC comic-like production and style Doom was already becoming known for at the time and keeps it fresh through a new character with a slightly darker spin. While Doom is obviously still a supervillain in the original persona, to me it's the difference between a sort of fun, old-school, cheesy Marvel comic book villain and a character like Heath Ledger's Joker in The Dark Knight. It's still a similar MO and setup, it's still for the same audience, but it's a little more darker, menacing, and more subtle. He even had a track on Mad Villainy that featured Viktor Vaughn, where Vaughn kind of steals his love interest away from him, and she ends up kind of choosing him because he's the cooler villain. This also isn't to insinuate there's anything lame or corny about the original Doom persona, because that couldn't be further from the case. When I say cheesy, I mean it only in a good way. It's the type of supervillains that you definitely had fear and respect for as a kid, but at the same time they'd have an element of humor or wit that made them strangely likable. It's a nostalgic sort of character where they're either taking revenge on the world for their own tragic backstory, or they're just evil for the hell of it and want to rule the world. But while that fun, lovable persona completely has its place in the other releases in his discography, Viktor Vaughn has a little more nuance and grit. One of the other things that separates Victor from Doom on here is for the most part he trades in his typical slower, lumbering flow for more speedy ones that match the pace of the instrumentals. But even when he's spitting bars at a breakneck speed, he never lets it compromise the lyrical content and schemes. If you aren't a big fan or aren't that familiar with him, you might just hear it as him doing the same flow over and over again. It might feel kind of stale to you. But if you're a rapper, you know how hard it is to sit in that pocket and kind of carve your own style out and make it sound dope and refreshing across multiple decades with all types of artists. It's really that pocket Doom sits in, and he excels at it so well. It's a slightly underappreciated art, in my opinion, for the common hip hop listener, where guys like Jay-Z and MF Doom are able to find these same pockets over all types of instrumentals, and they were really able to carve out that specific style and flow and make it work no matter what's thrown at them. He has lines and references that are deep enough to be decoded by some white kid in the suburbs, but what keeps him from being corny and kind of gives him this crossover appeal a lot of those guys don't have is he has a lot of veiled kind of street references that a lot of people from the hood are able to appreciate too. It's not just white boy nerd music. And this skill has let him bridge a gap I think really no other rapper has been able to quite the same way he did. One example of Doom being ahead of his time is when Kendrick put out his last album, he had a song called We Cry Together, where him and a female MC are kind of going back and forth with an argument. That track got a lot of attention, and while it was rightly deserved, it was a great piece of drama, and it was, really well written and performed. Every time I hear it, I personally always think of Can I Watch, which is a song off of this album with Apani B, and she plays a girl named Nikki, and they sort of detail a relationship being built up and then falling apart over the subsequent months. She's even credited as Nikki on here, and a lot of the features on Doom projects will get credited as a character name, which just goes to show how important creating a narrative is to him. I think it's just as important as anything else. The production on this thing is dark, brooding, and full of beats that just seem to get better with age. There's beats on here by King Honey, Heat Sensor, Max Bill, Mr. 10, and RJD2, as well as features by Lord Sear, M. Saeed, Louis Logic, and Creature, just to name a few. While I said Mad Villainy my favorite Doom record, I still think this one is virtually perfect. It's basically like comparing The Sopranos and The Wire. You might like one a little bit more or find, certain flaws in one of them, but both of them are practically perfect for all intents and purposes, and debating which one's more perfect is kind of a waste of time in my opinion. Vaudeville Villain has some of my favorite album art, production, verses, and atmosphere of any album in the 2000s, and it might take a few listens to click for you, but I promise it'll be worth it when it does. I think this will be a reoccurring theme where picking my 3 favorite songs is a bit of a challenge since all the albums I pick are albums I love and they all have way more than 3 songs I like, but in the spirit of being objective, for this album my 3 favorites are The Drop, the title track, and Ray Dawn. Thank you for checking out my second video. If you love hip-hop and want to join along on this journey with me, be sure to like and subscribe, and be sure to purchase as much physical media as you can for Doom to kind of support his family. And I'll be sure to catch you guys in the next one, alright? Okay.